Hey everyone. We are going to talk about water pollution. It's a huge topic, obviously, in AP Enviro. This is part one of the lecture series. There'll be two more parts coming up. It was just really too much to put into one presentation. If it was overwhelming for me, I knew it was going to be overwhelming for you. So let's begin our talk on wastewater. So, wastewater from animals and people. Water pollution is defined as the contamination of surface or groundwater with substances produced through human activities. Wastewater is water that's produced either by livestock operations or by human activities, including black water, which is sewage from toilets, and gray water, which is water from washing clothes, dishes, and bathing. Now, the livestock, even though livestock is animal, right, and water pollution is defined as substances produced through human activities, in terms of water pollution, the livestock waste would not be an issue if the livestock wasn't concentrated into one area, and we'll get to that more later. I also want you to remember that in the fall, during our water use unit, we actually talked about the difference between black water and gray water. So that's something to keep in mind as we move through this unit. So water pollution can be, well, pollution in general can be point source or non-point source. Point source pollution is produced from a distinct location. And in class, I often will talk to this as, can you point to a source, even though that's not really what it means. It means that the location can be pinpointed, like a sewage pipe that's leaking into a waterway, or perhaps a smokestack in terms of air pollution. Non-point source pollution is produced from a diffuse area, such as eutrophication from a stream from several nearby farms, and that could be livestock operations or agricultural fields, or smog from vehicle exhaust that occurs over an urban area. There's no real way to pinpoint any one source of that. It is diffuse and it comes from a large area. Point source pollution is easier to control and legislate than non-point source pollution. Obviously, if you got a pipe or a smokestack, you can say, I want you to do something about that. But when we're talking about non-point source pollution, that's many individuals over a large geographic area and from multiple sources. So that is obviously more difficult to control and to put legislation on. Okay, so scientists are concerned about wastewater pollution for three primary reasons. The first is that wastewater that is dumped into bodies of water undergoes aerobic decomposition by bacteria, which creates a large demand for oxygen in the water. And we call this high biochemical oxygen demand. We're going to talk more about that in a second. Nutrients are also released from this decomposition, particularly nitrogen and phosphorus. And these nutrients can make the water more fertile. This process is called eutrophication. You've heard about it before. We're going to talk more about it today. Wastewater can also carry pathogens. Pathogens are disease-causing organisms, and waterborne diseases are a huge issue in the developing world, even in the first world. So we're going to talk more about that a little bit. Okay, biochemical oxygen demand is defined as the amount of oxygen that a quantity of water uses over a specific period of time, that's key, and at specific temperatures. So if we're talking about experiments that can test BOD, the BOD has to be measured over a specific period of time and at a specific temperature. And if you're looking at an experiment for that, they will indicate that. So a lower BOD indicates that the water is probably less polluted by wastewater, whereas a higher BOD indicates that the water is more likely to be polluted by wastewater. And this is because the oxygen demand is dependent upon the amount of aerobic decomposition occurring in the water. So the greater the number of aerobic bacteria that are doing decomposition, the lower the amount of dissolved oxygen, the higher BOD, the higher biochemical oxygen demand there is for that bacteria. So they're using up all the oxygen. So the oxygen is going down, the level of oxygen is going down, and the biochemical oxygen demand is going up because those aerobic bacteria are demanding more oxygen for their decomposition. So when aerobic decomposition is occurring in a body of water, and I kind of alluded to this previously, much of that the oxygen there is used up by the microbes, which leaves less for other organisms. So this leads to a dissolved oxygen slump. DO is what I mentioned in the previous slide. That stands for dissolved oxygen. And possibly this creates a dead zone, which is an area that is so depleted of oxygen that very little aquatic life can survive there. Dead zones can actually be self-perpetuating. Organisms affected by the low oxygen in these areas will die and then are decomposed themselves. So let's kind of take apart this picture of that's going on down here. This is a super important picture right here. So we're talking about, in this particular picture, we're talking about point source pollution. So there is our pollution source right there. It's a sewage pipe that is discharging into a body of water. So the flow of the water is going from left to right. So the flow is this way in this picture. So we have an area that is called the clean zone, which is before the pipe is putting its effluent into the water. So we have a high level of dissolved oxygen and a low BOD, biochemical oxygen demand there. That means that the amount of oxygen that's in the water is high, and there's low biochemical oxygen demand because there is not a lot of decomposition happening. So here is where the pollution source comes into play. Where kind of in the area that this pollution is occurring, we end up with kind of a flip-flop of these two curves. The dissolved oxygen sags, and this is called the oxygen sag curve right there, and the BOD goes rapidly up. Okay, so you see that there's kind of an inverse relationship between these two, right? When BOD is high, DO is low. So the biochemical oxygen demand goes up because we have lots of aerobic decomposition happening because they're dealing with this waste stream. There's nutrients in the waste stream, and those aerobic bacteria are decomposing it. Because there's so much bacterial decomposition, the dissolved oxygen level actually begins to sag there. It's depleted because the aerobic bacteria are taking up all the oxygen in the water. Okay, so there's a flip-flop of these two curves. The septic zone, you can see that as we move further down from the pollution point source, the BOD begins to come down, and we get a bottoming out right here. This is where the bottom of the dissolved oxygen occurs. So it's falling in the decomposition zone. But when we get to the septic zone, that's really kind of where it bottoms out. So the greatest area between these two curves happens in the septic zone, which is right here. This is where our lowest dissolved oxygen is going to happen. There's really not going to be any fish present here. The only aquatic life that you're going to see is probably some sludge worms, mosquito larvae, and mosquito midge, which are juvenile mosquitoes. So we end up with kind of to use a non-scientific term, kind of a nasty area of water. It probably has a bad smell, and there's just not a lot that can tolerate this very low oxygen water. As we move down further away from the source of the pollution, we end up in the recovery zone. And you can see that the DO is coming back up to pre-pollution levels here, and the BOD is falling. We get fish species present again. But they're not the species that were present in the clean zone that happened before the pollution. So we get what we call trash fish. These are fish that can handle polluted waters. They can handle a lower amount of dissolved oxygen. We also get black fly and midge larvae there as well. So as we continue on further from the pollution source, the aquatic area is able to recover back to its clean zone status. So we end up with the normal species composition and biodiversity. We got trout, perch, bass, mayfly, stonefly, caddisfly larvae there, which is what we had before the pollution set in. So there's our clean zone, and we're kind of matching it again over here, and we're back up to our normal DO levels and back down to our low BOD there. So you can see that those curves are inverse. And again, I'm going to kind of stress that biochemical oxygen demand is opposite of dissolved oxygen. So when BOD is high, DO is low, and vice versa. All right, so I added the couple of pictures here from some images that I thought were important. So this image over here, right here, is the one I'm going to talk about first. We talked about dead zones. So a dead zone is an area that has very little, if any, aquatic life, and the reason why is because it's hypoxic, meaning it has very low oxygen. It can even be anoxic, which means that there's no oxygen, but that's actually pretty rare. So you can see right here, this is the Gulf of Mexico. The more red the area, the lower the DO, and the greener the area, the higher the DO. The lowest DO is right here where the Mississippi River enters the Gulf of Mexico. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. So the Gulf of Mexico has a seasonal dead zone that covers about 6,000 square miles, which is a pretty big area. It forms each April and it peaks in July. There's very little sea life that lives in this area, especially at the height of each dead zone season. The only species that you find aquatically there is low oxygen tolerant species. Jellyfish are abundant. They don't really care about the low oxygen conditions, so they float through there. But with the exception of jellyfish and some other low oxygen tolerant species, it's pretty dead. So why does it form right there in the Gulf of Mexico, and primarily where the Mississippi dumps in? And this is, you can see that there's some hot spots here besides that Mississippi area. It's kind of located where a lot of the rivers drain in. So the dead zone forms due to agricultural runoff that's carried to the Gulf, primarily from the Mississippi River, but from some other rivers that feed in as well. And you can kind of see the rivers kind of flowing down here. And I liked this picture here because it shows the Mississippi drains a huge part of the eastern United States. So, the Mississippi Basin area where all of this is draining from, I mean, if you want to talk about non-point source pollution, it's pulling from an incredibly large area. And so these rivers accumulate a heavy nutrient pollution load before they reach the sea. And then they're dumping into a fairly concentrated area here in the Gulf. And that is what is creating this aerobic decomposition. When all these nutrients dump into the Gulf is what's creating that dead zone. So when wastewater decomposes, it releases nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus. So we're going to talk a little bit more about eutrophication here. You should already kind of know this, and we talked about it first semester, but here's a review of it. So nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus increase the fertility of water. This process is called eutrophication. Specifically, cultural eutrophication is an increase of nutrients in water due to anthropogenic inputs. Technically, eutrophication can occur from any source. So anytime there's an uptick in nutrient load, whether that's anthropogenic or not, it can be considered eutrophication. But particularly cultural eutrophication is caused by humans. Fertile water leads to algal blooms. The overgrowth of algae from the algal bloom eventually dies, and those algae are decomposed by aerobic bacteria. The decomposition again creates a high biochemical oxygen demand, which then reduces dissolved oxygen in the area. And you just saw a graph on that. That's the oxygen sag curve, right? So the low dissolved oxygen then causes other species to die, which again can lead to a creation of a dead zone in the water. And like I said before, the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico is caused by heavy nutrient load from fertilizer inputs on farms, as well as the release of agricultural wastewater that drains into the Gulf. And this is primarily from the Mississippi, but also from other rivers that dump there into the Gulf. So a pathogen is a disease-causing organism, and these can include bacteria, viruses, and protists as well. Wastewater carries pathogens. It often does, and you can imagine why. So keeping wastewater from contaminating drinking water has always been a problem for human societies. You definitely do not want your waste getting into water because human and livestock waste can cause disease. So what are some diseases that are caused by waterborne pathogens? Cholera, hepatitis, typhoid fever, all kinds of gastroenteritis and gastrointestinal illnesses, and many diarrheal diseases. Cholera and hepatitis A are the most common waterborne diseases worldwide. Cholera is most common in the developing world. It's rare in the developed world. But hepatitis A is found worldwide, even in developed nations. Hepatitis A is usually the result of poor sanitation, and it's often contracted from restaurants who are not following proper sanitation protocols. Testing for the presence of pathogens in water is usually done via something called an indicator species. And we often use an indicator species such as fecal coliform bacteria. It's really not feasible to test for every waterborne contaminant that could actually be in the water. And so the presence or absence of an indicator species is a relatively reliable and fairly straightforward way to figure out whether or not water has been contaminated by wastewater. So, like I said, an indicator species is an organism that indicates whether or not disease-causing pathogens are likely to be present. E. coli is a type of fecal coliform bacteria that's found in the human gut. If E. coli are found to be present in the water in high rates, there's an increased chance that the water has been contaminated with wastewater. And I just stuck in a sign here. This is a sign that you will sometimes find on beaches about warning about high bacteria levels. If an area is found to be contaminated with fecal coliform bacteria, municipalities are required to advise potential swimmers of that. And that is what one of those signs looks like. Bink. That is a waterborne bacteria sign warning people not to swim. Okay, so how can wastewater be treated? So, I mean, I've said before, keeping your wastewater out of your drinking water is a huge deal so that you don't get sick. So there's a lot of humans on the planet, and how do we keep the water that, you know, that's contaminated with wastewater, how do we keep that from getting us sick? Well, in rural areas, especially for domestic use, people often use septic systems. So what's a septic system? Well, it's a system that consists of a septic tank, which is a large container, usually made of concrete, that receives wastewater from a house. And then a leach field, which is a series of underground pipes with tiny perforations in them from which the water can slowly seep out. And slowly is the key word here, because as the water slowly seeps out, it's filtered by the ground, and also the waste is decomposed by soil microbes. So the wastewater in the septic tank is periodically treated with waste decomposing bacteria. You pour like a little packet of these bacteria in, and then you flush your toilet, and then they get into the septic tank and they eat up the bad stuff. Septic systems work with gravity, and they're therefore energy efficient. They don't need pumps. They're located, the way that they drain is that they're located kind of on a downhill slope. But sludge from the tank must be professionally pumped out every 5 to 10 years, depending on how heavy you use your tank. And if you fail to do this, you can have a septic system backup, and that is no fun. Urban areas, or areas that are connected to sewer pipes, are usually served by centralized sewage treatment facilities. Sewage treatment can be broken down into 3 phases: primary, secondary, and an optional tertiary phase. The primary phase is mechanical. Waste is screened and allowed to settle in a big tank. And we're going to go through this one. There's a picture that I'm going to show you. We're going to walk through step by step. The second phase is biological and chemical. The water, once the water has been screened and allowed to settle, the water is siphoned off, and that water, which is still pretty contaminated, is aerated with a pump, and aerobic bacteria are added to help break down the waste. When that process is done, there's another settling process, and the dead bacteria are siphoned off, and the water is then siphoned off of the tank and then treated chemically or with UV light for disinfection. If there's no tertiary treatment, the secondary phase ends with chemical disinfection using chlorine or ozone, or a dousing with ultraviolet light, which kills pathogens, and then the treated wastewater is returned to a body of water. The tertiary phase, again, is optional. Most sewage treatment plants in the U.S. do not use this, but some do. It is usually designed to remove substances such as nitrogen and phosphorus, and this is often done when the wastewater is going to be used for agricultural purposes, and they need a high quality water that doesn't contain additional nutrients. So here's a key: whether at the end of secondary or tertiary treatment, disinfection, whether that's with chlorine, ozone, or ultraviolet light, is always the final step in the treatment process. If your wastewater treatment plant only has 2 phases, primary and secondary, then disinfection happens at the end of secondary. If your wastewater treatment plant has 3 phases, primary, secondary, and tertiary, then disinfection will happen at the end of the tertiary phase. So let's look at the steps so you can envision them a little bit more. All right, so this is actually the picture that is also in your textbook. So let's go through step by step. So step 1, bink, this is where we're starting. Underground pipes from residences or from businesses carry waste to a treatment plant. All right, so the large debris is filtered out by screens, and that's this step right here. This is often called a grit screen. Yay, grit. This is called a grit screen, and it's screened so that, you know, any large pieces of stuff is filtered out. The grit is then dried in a dryer, and that is sent to a landfill that will accept human waste. And if you guys remember our visit to the landfill, only certain sanitary landfills will accept human sewage. All right, so this is a settling tank. Once the water's been screened, right, it goes into a tank where the solids settle to the bottom and the water up at the top kind of floats up. So the sludge, the solids at the bottom, are then sucked off down through a pipe, and that sludge is processed down this way. And we're going to leave that for that time period because we're going to get more sludge from the secondary treatment. The water is then siphoned off. The water minus the sludge is siphoned off, and it's sent to this aeration tank. This is the secondary treatment. The thing that you see in the middle that looks like a little beautiful fountain is the aeration tank. So air is being pumped in, and the reason that they're aerating that water is because they're adding aerobic bacteria in there, which help with the decomposition process. Once that runs for a number of days and that aerobic bacteria have decomposed the waste as much as they can, the aerator is shut off, and that tank is allowed to settle. And again, the sludge from the dead bacteria and anything else that was floating in there comes down this way, and it combines with the sludge from the primary step. Okay, so now the sludge is thickened. The water is either siphoned off or it is it's generally siphoned off, and then you get a thick sludge. The sludge is then dried. And it can be taken to a landfill, it can be burned, or it can be used for fertilizer, depending on what the municipality allows. Okay. And then this is the step here that we were talking about, bacterial breakdown. Okay. So now we are over here. The water is siphoned off here. And in these tanks, the water is now exposed to chemicals like chlorine or ozone or ultraviolet light. So this is our disinfection stage. And in this particular picture, this water treatment plant only has a primary and secondary phase. So the disinfection is happening at the end of the secondary phase. If there were a tertiary phase, the tertiary phase would come here before disinfection. And that would primarily remove nitrogen and phosphorus, and then disinfection would happen. After disinfection, the treated wastewater is returned to a body of water, whatever is close, river, lake. It's generally a river or lake. So older sewage treatment plants often receive wastewater from storm water runoff. So they're not only getting sewage from homes and businesses, but they also receive wastewater when it rains in the form of stormwater runoff. These plants are located close to bodies of water so that when the combined volume of stormwater and wastewater overflow the plant's capacity, the overflow can be pumped into an adjacent body of water. Okay, process that. So we're getting stormwater and poop water, and they're mixing and they're overflowing into a body of water. The EPA estimates that the overflow of raw sewage from these older sewage treatment plants happens about 40,000 times annually, which contaminates beaches, drinking water, fish, and shellfish beds. Awesome. So the solution, of course, is to modernize the older treatment plants, but this is really expensive. It takes a lot to either retrofit these plants or to build new ones in their place. I will say that thankfully, all of Dallas's wastewater treatment plants have been modernized, so we have none that overflow into the Trinity. But the reason that they're down on I-45 south of Dallas along the Trinity is because they used to overflow into the Trinity when we had heavy rains. Thankfully, they do not do that anymore. All right, let's talk about CAFOs. Yay, we're back to CAFOs. CAFOs use something called manure lagoons to dispose of the enormous amount of waste products that are produced on site. You can imagine that jamming 50,000 cows into an area produces a lot of poop. Same is true with pigs or chickens or whatever it is they're raising. A manure lagoon is a human-made pond lined with rubber that is built to handle large amounts of animal waste, and it is just as fantabulous as you can possibly imagine. It is a huge poop-filled pond. The rubber barrier keeps the manure from leaching into the groundwater, theoretically, but liners often leak. Aerobic bacteria can be added to the lagoon to help the breakdown of waste, and it also sometimes helps the smell, although the smell is absolutely overwhelming. Here's the problem. It rains, and when the rains come, they overflow the pond. So the overflow of manure happens into adjacent bodies of water, which obviously causes wastewater pollution and eutrophication.